Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin and welcome back to Kerbal Rising. After quite a long hiatus of about 2 to 3 months, but we should be back to relatively regular uploads from now on. Just in case you've forgotten, in the times since last episode we conquered Sonus and promptly colonised it, adding another 4 points to our total at the beginning and end of every turn. We also dispatched our stealth frigate, the ISS Anubis, to Moho, destroying a UFN frigate that was sent to investigate the previous disappearance of one of their corvettes, but we did have to withdraw it at the end of the turn because it had run out of torpedoes. But after we've resupplied it at Drados, we should be sending it out again for another mission at the end of this episode. Anyway, today we are sending the Crimson Fleet, which is newly resupplied with a IO class heavy frigate, and of course all our Mars frigates having pretty drastic overhauls, and of course the ISS Fortitude, which we launched last turn, our Venus class destroyer. They are heading out to Olu'um, the brown dwarf star on the edge of the Kerbal system. Now this is entirely uncharted territory. We've never sent any probes or any expeditions out here before, but man, look at that. You can see the star in its early formation with its accretion disk around it. It is absolutely stunning, and the visuals throughout this episode are going to be just mind-blowing. We're also sending our 3 carriers, the ISS Victory, Spirit of Drados, and Trojan, out to invade the planets that we shall be conquering. The first planet we will be encountering is Fume, right on the edge of the system. It's got quite high gravity and a very thick atmosphere, so there aren't actually any ground forces, but it is home to a, well, decently sized border patrol force. So we've jammed their communications, you know, standard operating procedure, and as you see, deploying from our carriers here, 2 Phoebe class skiffs, the ISS Rubicon and the ISS Abyss. Now all they carry are anti-ship lasers, but they should be pretty useful in the battles to come. So this patrol doesn't look particularly friendly, so we're going to open up with a torpedo salvo. Now we do actually have an Aerospace class corvette in reserve, but we have 4 torpedoes mounted on the ISS Fortitude, so we're just keeping that in reserve for the next space battle because there are a couple of fleets around Olu'um, and there's no point sending it into harm's way when we don't need to. Now we're facing off against a single corvette, 2 skiffs, and a light frigate. Now that light frigate is the only ship in this patrol that actually has railguns, so of course we're sending all of our torpedoes straight after this because we don't know how well it's armoured, and we know it's got some pretty big and pretty powerful guns on it, so we're sending all of our torpedoes straight towards it. Turns out that was kind of overkill because a single torpedo manages to land and the whole light frigate just peels open like a banana. It's just gone in one hit. Turns out the word light frigate in its transponder, it wasn't kidding. It's only got 150mm of armour, and although we tried to redirect one of the torpedoes to hit one of the skiffs there, we just narrowly missed. So we did sort of waste 3 torpedoes, but hey, it's better to be safe than sorry, and I'm pretty sure that frigate won't be bothering us. So now we can close with the Crimson Fleet proper. The reason we've launched the Phoebe class skiffs and the IO class heavy frigate is essentially because our fleet was very lacking when it came to close quarter battles. Though we had some very powerful railguns mounted aboard the destroyer and of course our Mars class frigates, they are not very good when it comes to close range slugging matches. So the IO has 2 75mm chain guns which should shred anything within 8 kilometers, and of course the Phoebe classes have anti-ship lasers. You get those within about 2.5 kilometers, they can do some pretty terrible damage to enemy vessels. But until then, we're just going to be opening up with the railguns. We see the ISS Conqueror and the Vanguard opening up there with their railguns, and of course the Fortitude roaring with its mighty 155mm railgun, which does take a little while to reload, but as we can see here, whereas the 55s are just missing and traveling at a much slower velocity, you can just about catch the 155 there flying in and smacking that corvette, just glancing it, you see it just tearing through anything that faces it. The only thing that can stop a 155mm tungsten slug traveling at Mach 9 is 500mm of armor or a lot of angling. Yeah, there's really not much that can stop those. I've had quite a few people complain about me using Mach numbers while in space. It's still perfectly acceptable to use Mach numbers while you're in space. You can just assume I'm talking about the speed of sound at sea level. Okay, guys? It's much easier to say Mach 9 than whatever the equivalent is in meters per second. It's over, I think it's over 1,000, isn't it? Yeah, it is. It's well over 1,000. It's a couple of thousand meters per second. Very fast, anyway. But once we've pulverized the enemy fleet with our railguns for long enough, we decide to close with our Phoebe-class skiffs and we begin opening up with our anti-ship lasers. However, the enemy skiffs have got ship lasers of their own. However, they each only have a single laser, whereas each of our skiffs have actually got a pair of them. So we have a much higher damage output. And once the Havoc enters the fray, yeah, the enemy patrol really isn't going to last particularly long. We see those 75mm rounds flying in there. We do have to get a little bit closer before our fire starts getting a little bit more accurate, but the enemy patrol really isn't long for this world. Turns out as well, the power generation on these skiffs is particularly vulnerable. So one 75mm there just cleans off one of its pylons, and then it can't generate enough power to actually power its main laser. So these skiffs are now completely defenseless and just utterly helpless to our anti-ship lasers, although missing at the moment. As we get closer, they get a little bit more accurate and they start cleaving the enemy ships in twain. Now, just as we're closing here, I want to clarify something about my vessels. We've introduced a couple of new ship classes this episode, and a lot of you have been wondering, Beardy, why is it that the first ship of each class isn't named for the class? You know, the class isn't named the Rubicon class or the Fortitude class. That's because the first ship in every class is actually used as a test bed to test the vessel. It's just part of the Imperial Navy's scheme of introducing new classes to the Navy. It needs to go through a rigorous testing scheme. So we actually blast them with torpedoes and massive rail guns, essentially, to see how much of a beating they can take. And then we salvage parts off of it and then use that to make the real first vessel in the class, which doesn't take the name. So the ISS Venus is lying in a boneyard back on Dradis, the moon of Drados, after being thoroughly tested and then being salvaged for parts and then cannibalized and turned into the ISS Fortitude. So just clarifying something for you there. It's definitely not because I want to name my classes something different to the first ship of every class, because calling something the ISS Venus is kind of lame, but having classes named after planetary bodies in our solar system is kind of fun. Anyway, moving on. So as you can see, the ISS Fortitude is now within range and we're laying waste to this fleet. The 4 30mm cannons on the Fortitude can just rip anything with less than 300mm of armor to ribbons. So yeah, these ships aren't going to last particularly long. Just adjusting the course of the ISS Havoc here so that its 75mm are a little bit more accurate, and we're bringing it in a little closer to the last remaining ships in this squadron. But yeah, they're really not particularly long for this world. As you see, this skiff here, completely defenseless at this point, now just being torn asunder by our anti-ship lasers tearing into it. And yeah, they're doing a pretty awesome amount of damage at this kind of range. So you're just adjusting the course of our Phoebe class skiffs and actually taking over manual control now, so we can get a bit more accuracy on them, because when you start to get close to enemy vessels, BD guard mode does play up a bit. You really need to have the vessels in front of you for the aiming to work properly. Still having a few problems with space combat with BD Armory, but it's working relatively well all the same. But space battles do take a very, very long time, unfortunately, which is sort of part of the reason this episode took so long. Is each of these battles took about 4 hours. Yeah, this one I think was about 2.5 to 3 hours, and then the battle, which is going to be in the next part of this turn, I think took about 4 to 5 hours. But as we see here, this skiff pilot is not content to merely be shot at and torn asunder with nothing to say about it. Unfortunately, with the amount of chunks that have been blown off of his skiff, it's impossible to actually control the craft. So while he does try to kamikaze into the ISS Fortitude, we just pretty easily pick him off with our point defense lasers. So now, with the border forces of the Teleusian Protectorate destroyed, we can send in our first two carriers, the ISS Victory and the ISS Trojan, both carrying a pair of Alara fighters. These are inbound to the next planet in the Olu'um system, Bollocks, which is a kind of abandoned industrial world. It's got a very polluted atmosphere, clearly some kind of massive reactor explosion or something made the world virtually uninhabitable, but if our readings are correct, it was a paradise at one point, but perhaps some kind of accident rendered it as it is today, with a relatively thin atmosphere and a huge ever-present cyclone covering almost one entire face of the world. Now the name Telosian Protectorate, we think, according to our historians, is some kind of remnant from when the Olu'um system was actually a relatively autonomous colony of the Territorial Arctic Protection Entente, but then when contact was lost with Kerbin, I think they kept the name Protectorate in hopes of one day actually re-establishing contact. But out here on the absolute fringes of the Kerbal system, an expedition back to Kerbin without a Kerbstein drive is a very long and very perilous affair, so no wonder they're still holding out hope today, even though we know that, of course, the world that used to be Kerbin is now, was overrun by the Gaian Confederacy, who probably destroyed any probes entering the system, and is now controlled by us, and it has a populace of very obedient citizens who we definitely didn't lobotomize. Anyway, so moving on, as you see, we have our 4 Alara fighters, and we have a single one which stands out from the rest, with black markings over its wings, painted in the true colours of the Drados Imperium, and piloted by the head of our flying school back on Drados, because Bollocks has got a bit of a thin atmosphere actually, kind of similar to Drados itself, although Drados does almost have a breathable atmosphere. You do need to actually wear a mask, but you can go outside without a spacesuit now. Hey, terraforming project's coming along, guys! Although it will probably take another 100 years before it's turned into an actual garden, which, of course, has made our people as strong as they are. But either way, he has the most experience in this kind of field, so we're sending him out. His name is John B. Kerbin. He's got some kind of relation to some long-dead ace pilot from back the time of the Great War back on Kerbin, but his bloodline is pretty messy. We've lost a lot of records from that time, but all we know is that he is our most capable pilot in this current day and age, and he is going to be leading his 3 wingmen to the single outpost on the surface. Now, most forces seem to have abandoned the world long since, but there is a force of X-34Bs, antimatter powered aircraft, just sort of keeping a light garrison over the planet, and obviously just in a position so they can quickly respond to any incursions in Bollocks airspace. Well, we're going to quickly dispatch them. They're certainly not firestorms or liberators, and the Alara should be more than capable of dealing with them. So, as with any dogfight with antimatter-powered aircraft, beginning the initial joust and firing all of our missiles off in one go, and then splitting our formation to try and avoid them. Once again, easily outrunning conventional missiles. We need to implement maybe some kind of antimatter-powered missile. Perhaps I can make a custom antimatter-powered missile with the modular missile guidance, but I don't know. Fitting an antimatter reactor and antimatter engine into the size of a missile seems pretty difficult. Antimatter weapons are certainly not reliable. They're pretty damn dangerous to use, so I don't know. We might not use them. At the moment, missiles are pretty good for just distracting enemy aircraft. As you see, these aircraft, although they're not as fast, and certainly not as stable as our Alaras, although the first one gets blown out of the sky pretty easily by one of our missiles, they do seem to be rather manoeuvrable. John B here just pulling a pretty insane maneuver to get some of the missiles off of his tail, since the atmosphere here is so thin that our aircraft can maneuver better than enemy missiles can, because we have such a large wing surface, so just leading missiles into the ground seems to be a pretty decent tactic. Now, although we do then lose one of our wingmen to one of the X-34 missiles, John B then swiftly flies in, dispatching the person who ridded him of one of his wingmen, and he's immediately on the tail of the next X-34, not giving them any quarter. And as you see, we do a decent amount of damage as it begins to enter sort of scissoring contest with us. But our wingman soon flies in to drive him off his tail. Ah, look at this beautiful teamwork as our Dradosian pilots fight to gain the upper hand. Now, one of our wingmen has actually been off chasing another of the X-34s and damaged one of his wings, and he then cartwheeled into the ground as we saw just down there. So now there is only a single X-34 left, and here's a pretty funny thing. Actually, I'm not sure whether we blew up like the antimatter containment on this aircraft, or if it just ran out of fuel. But the X-34 has run out of antimatter. I don't know how this happened. I think we might well have shot up one of his antimatter tanks. He might have shut it down or something. I don't know. You would think if we breached an antimatter tank, he wouldn't still be here. Perhaps they just didn't actually put enough antimatter on these aircraft. But either way, whatever happened, this aircraft is now antimatter. There's nothing I can do about that. So now it's just a complete sitting duck. And after doing a couple of passes and damaging it a bit, he ditches into the ocean, and the airspace of Bollocks is now ours. So in the next episode we will be heading on to Telos, the capital of the Telos Protectorate, and subjugating, bringing order to the rest of the Olu'um system. That will actually be in the same turn, so it will be in the next episode, probably just over the next week, because I did quite a lot in this episode. And there's a whole other fleet protecting Telos, a much, much bigger fleet, as they're bringing in the bulk of their forces to deal with the new threat to their sovereignty. But as I said, that'll be in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I do hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time.